Greetings from Tokyo. I'm Trip, and welcome to the Hammer of Wrath. This week, you and I are going to paint a Votann combat patrol. Let's go. Thanks for joining me in the studio. This week, you and I are going to continue our monthly Combat Patrol Challenge by tackling the Leagues of Votann Combat Patrol. But first, I want to talk very, very briefly about snow. Having lived in Tokyo for 4 winters now, I can talk to you about something that I find a little bit strange. It seems to snow for exactly 1 day here in Tokyo. Between February 10th and February 15th of every year that I have been here, it gets cold enough to snow. And it snows heavily that 1 day. But usually, by a day or two later, it's melted away. In fact, this year I shot the intro to our video on February the 12th, and exactly 6 days later, it was 72 degrees outside. Now, my wife, who grew up in Tokyo, assures me that when she was a kid, this wasn't the case, and they had snow all winter long. I'm not going to get all political here, but maybe there's something to this whole climate change thing. Regardless, today we are going to make some snowy and icy bases for our Leagues of Votann Combat Patrol. Now, if you've been following the channel for any length of time, you'll remember that I started this Combat Patrol last year and went straight for the Khal. I like to eat my dessert first. And for him, I created a frozen lake base. You can see the video here. Over the summer, I also finished the Bezerkers from the kit, and despite the fact that those models were very tiny and the hoses and tubes were a bit fiddly, I still had fun putting those together. So today, we are going to round out the Combat Patrol by completing the infantry and the 3 hover bikes. So let me show you how I built and painted a Votann Combat Patrol. I've decided to paint the Trans-Hyperion Alliance simply because I've never painted an orange army before. I'm using the airbrush here to make sure that the oranges go on smoothly and cleanly. Oranges and yellows can be really difficult to paint with a normal brush. Here I've just mixed in a little yellow, and I'm doing a top-down zenithal to give the shape some volume. And then I'll go through and sort of painstakingly pin wash all of the details on the models using some Agrax Earthshade. This does take some time, but really makes the details pop. Once I've got that down, I'm going to go ahead and paint a white stripe on the pauldron here. That's going to give us some place to put our squad markings. And then I'll go through and weather the armor with a technique called sponge chipping. I'm using a dark gray and then just working my way around the model, hitting all the high spots. With the armor complete, it's time to move on to the fatigues, and I'm just going to work my way around the model using a cold gray from Vallejo paint. This is going to give us even coverage over the fatigues in a single coat. And then I'll use Games Workshop's Administratum gray on the knee pads, elbow pads, and the boots. We'll also paint our metallics using Games Workshop's Lead Belcher, and then we'll wash everything using Games Workshop's Contrast Basilicanum gray. You can use Nuln Oil or another shade for this, but I just like the way that the contrast flows over the model. Once that's dried, we'll do a quick dry brush using Lead Belcher to bring out all the highlights, and then we'll work our way around the model doing the smaller details like chest lamps and the plasma blades. Here I wanted to go for a fire effect, so we're going to lay down a base of yellow, and then we'll dab some orange on there, and then as it gets towards the edge of the blade where it would be a bit cooler, we're going to bring in a darker red color. I actually might go back and change these to a blue plasma just to get a really nice color break from the orange armor, but that's always something you can change later. Once we have our decals down, it's just a matter of going around and finishing a few small details on the models, like the heat effect on this rail rifle. For the squad leader, I wanted to do something a little different. I wanted him to stand out from the rest of the Hearthkin Warriors, so I decided to keep his armor white and sort of invert the formula. Where they had orange armor and a white shoulder stripe, he'll have white armor and an orange shoulder stripe. So we'll apply our whites, go through and do our sponge chipping just like we did on the others. And to do all the pouches on these, I have a really simple recipe. I just lay down a khaki, and then I use Games Workshop's Contrast Wildwood. Now, I like to keep the heads separate on my models to make sure that I can detail them out and then put them in. Often, if you put them inside the helmets, whether it's a Space Marine or a Hearthkin Warrior, it can be difficult to get to the details on the face. So here, we're going to do a few different skin tones for the squad. For the darker skin colors, I like to start with an umber as an undercoat, and then I'll work my way up using some warmer browns, like Games Workshop's Mournfang Brown, as a highlight. And for the Caucasian faces, I like to use Kislev Flesh with a lighter tone, maybe mixed in with some white coming down on top of that. And then all the faces will go ahead and get a wash of Reikland Flesh Shade. That just keeps them warm and rich looking. These guys are out in the cold. We want that sort of ruddy look on their faces. And then they pop off really easily because I've simply hot glued them to this sprue. We'll attach them using plastic cement and then finish our bases with some Games Workshop texture paint and a little Valhalla Blizzard to keep that cold theme. Moving on to the Berserkers, we're going to go ahead and do a Zenithal highlight over a black prime. This is going to give us our shapes, help us define where we want our highlights and our shadows to be on the model. In this example here, I'm going to use some Kislev Flesh as a base coat, then Reikland Flesh Shade wash over the entire model. Once that's done, we're going to dry brush on our highlights here. We're going to go back to Kislev Flesh, and then I'm going to use some Pale Elf Flesh from Vallejo as a final highlight on the faces and the upper chest to create volumes in the shapes. Now we want to do something a little different here. These are a Berserker unit. I want to help set them apart, and they're playing sort of skins in a shirts and skins game, but we want to differentiate them even more from the Warriors. So we're going to give them green fatigues, hit that with an Chthonian Camo Shade wash, and then we'll unify them by doing the same thing on the pads and shoes that we did on the Warriors there. We do want them to be related. I'll work my way around the model now using Games Workshop's Lead Belcher on all the metallic parts, including the cybernetic implants and these power hoses going to the gauntlets. Now, because they are bare-chested, there's only a few places that we can use that orange to sort of tie them into the army, so we're going to do that on the power pack here and also the power fists. Because we're not airbrushing this on, we're brushing it on. It's actually going to take 2 or 3 coats. Then we'll go through and finish the base using Games Workshop texture paints and the Valhalla Blizzard, just like we've done on the others. Now, most of the Berserkers in this squad don't have the power gauntlets, only the Sergeant does, so they have these plasma blades. And we're doing something similar to what we did on the small knives and the Warriors, and we're sort of creating this fire effect using different layers of yellow, orange, and red. Moving on to the Hearthkin Pioneers, if I'm being honest, this is the reason why I bought the squad, this and the Khal, which we'll see next. I like painting vehicles, and it's been a while since I've done anything, so this was going to scratch that itch. So we'll go through and use the airbrush to apply all those oranges. And then I'm going to take some orange and yellow mixed together, and I'm going to dry brush that all over the model. Here we're catching all the raised edges, and you'll see here it's starting to define the shapes and give them volume. The upper surfaces are getting that sort of highlight color and helping round out all the shapes. Then we'll go through and sponge chip everything here. It's the same way. We're going to use that dark gray, but because this is a vehicle, we want to focus all the chipping on the front-facing edges, right? So we imagine as this thing is sailing across alien worlds, debris and rocks are kicking up, so most of that chipping damage is going to be on the front-facing. I've also hot glued this to a 25mm base so that I can temporarily use a painting handle on it. You don't really want to handle your models. It's a great way to rub the paint off on the corners and high edges as you're painting. It can be very frustrating, so I really recommend a painting handle, or if you don't have one of those, just like using an old wine cork and some poster tack is really helpful. So once I've got the armor panels done, I'm going to go ahead and move through all my metallics here, and using Lead Belcher. If you've watched the channel for any amount of time, you know I have an absolute love affair with this paint. I adore it. It goes on in a single coat. And once we've got that down, I'll use Basilicanum Gray to wash all those and age them down. Now we need to decide on the color scheme for our riders, and we actually have a really great example here. I've kept the gunner on one of the bikes separate, otherwise it'd be impossible to get to these details. And so we'll use that sort of as a test model to try some things out. And we're going to use the green fatigues from the Berserkers and the darker pads that we've done on all the units so far. And then we'll go around, and I thought it'd be really cool if he had like a heavy leather coat, right? So we'll paint the inside khaki, and then we're going to lay down some burnt umber on the outside here. This is from Vallejo. It's going to take 2 coats, and it dries really matte, which is great because then we're going to do a dry brush of Mournfang Brown over top here. It's going to catch all the highlights and warm it up, and it starts to give this really great leather appearance. And then we'll finish with a final dry brush of Kislev Flesh, and we want to make sure that's really dusty. It creates this really fun leather effect with very little effort. Then we'll go through and wash the darker parts of the model, and then we'll wash the fatigues. Want to, drop those shadows and recesses in. And when we finish the gun and the details on the head, this is what we're left with. So we'll just go through and apply that to all the other riders. And looking at this, it's too orange. There's just too much. I like it orange, and I thought it was interesting to paint an orange army, but this was orange overload. So what I wanted to do here was sort of break that up by painting a racing stripe down the center. So what I'll do is just paint a guideline and then slowly work that wider and wider, making sure I'm using really even brush strokes. We'll chip that later, of course, with some sponge chipping and make like it's worn off. And then I want to do the grav plates here. I had a really fun idea, so I'm going to go ahead and airbrush these blue. If we get a little overspray on the orange plates, it's fine. It'll look like a glow, like an object source light. And we'll go through and hit that bottom edge with a little white here to get a gradient. And once we've got our airbrush colors in, I'll just go through and using that same dark gray, I'm going to paint each of the splines on this so it looks like it's glowing from the inside. So with the models completed, we're going to go ahead and attach the rider there, and we're going to work on our bases. Larger bases like this are an opportunity for some storytelling, and we've been going with this sort of cold, frozen tundra theme, but this is the chance to go even a little farther, and we're going to do a frozen lake. So on this one here, I've sort of marked out the area where I'm going to put my resin, and then using the airbrush, I'm bringing in some blues and blue-greens. We want to paint what's going to be under the ice, and then we're going to use this. This is clear UV resin. I just picked this up at the dollar store. We're going to go ahead and just squeeze that onto the base. Now, because it's so thick, it has this really great property where it slowly spreads out, but doesn't go over the edge. The cohesion of the resin just sort of keeps it on the base, and then we'll scuff that up with some sandpaper, and we get this really fun sort of frosted matte surface. And on this larger one that's entirely lake, on the base itself under the resin, I painted a crack, and then I'll also carve a crack in, and it gives it this really fun dimensionality. Now on this one, which is all earth, we're going to apply some Valhalla Blizzard, and then I had an idea. These grav plates should be doing like an object source. They should be projecting light and energy onto the ground. So before we attach our models, we'll go ahead and airbrush some effects there, and we'll use some Revell plastic glue. It's really great plastic glue if you can get your hands on it. Moving on to the Khal. I have a separate video for this one. I linked it at the beginning here. You can check it out. It goes into more detail on how I finished it. Basically, we're going to follow the same formula that we've done for the fatigues and boots. Now, I've inversed the color formula here because we want our Khal, we want our leader to stand out. So he's going to have white armor, and it almost makes that squad leader we did earlier. He's like a Khal in training. He's got white armor, but as you'll see, it's not nearly as ornate. And I've decided not to do armor chipping on this. I like to imagine that because he's the Khal, he has this underling that's constantly maintaining his armor, so it looks absolutely impeccable. We'll go through and paint his cape on the underside. We're going to use that khaki that we used on the inside of the Hearthkin Pioneers cape. Again, we want to limit our palette here, and even though some of the palette choices are inverted, we still want to have some colors run through all of the squads, sort of unifying them. And we've done that in the dark gray on the boots and gloves and fatigues and things like that. And we'll also do it on the linings of the coats. Now here on the power axe, we're going to do that fire effect, plasma effect. It looks great here, and this was the first one that I painted. I was like, yeah, orange fire axe against this white armor is going to look great. Not realizing that, the rest of the army was going to be orange, and they were going to have orange weapons, and it doesn't look, there's not enough pop there. So I might go back and change these to a blue plasma at some point. Now the base here, if you want more detail, I go into this and how I created this custom sculpted 3D base to hold the resin so that the rock would be submerged in the ice here. So I've painted that up. We'll attach it to this resin base, and then using the clear UV resin, we'll fill that up, and this way the rock actually comes up from the ice, not like it's floating on top of the ice. Then we'll just go ahead and using some plastic glue, we'll attach the sub-assemblies. Now, I've given him this axe. In the instructions for the combat patrol, he's supposed to have the power fist, but honestly, I don't know what kind of monster gives a dwarf something that's not an axe. And there you have it, 1 Leagues of Votann Combat Patrol completed, including icy frozen lake bases. I hope you enjoyed the video. It was my genuine pleasure to make and share it with you. If you'd like to support the channel, please like, comment, or subscribe. That will drive us to the front page of YouTube and help grow our audience. And of course, you can always join our Patreon, linked in the description below. Remember that joining our Patreon at any level grants you access to our private Discord server, where like-minded hobbyists help each other every day with honest and kind feedback. Thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you on the next one.